So welcome along to a brand new episode of Writer's Routine, where this week we're chatting to the Cosy Crime author J.M. Hall. We chat about writing longhand and not understanding those who don't. Also, how retirement changes the routine, and why working as a primary school teacher really helped him refine storytelling.
I tell stories to the kids that I make up. And you know when you're telling a story, you know the second you've lost them. You know the second you're going on too long, you're being self-indulgent, you're repeating, you can see it, and you have to bring it back. And that is something that you carry through into your writing. You think, now, I love this description of the Yorkshire moors on an autumn day. Is anyone else going to?
Stick around, there's more with J.M. Hall in this week's Writer's Routine. This week's episode is sponsored by Faber Academy. Their flagship writing course is back. And so many authors that I've chatted to on the show that have had their books published have graduated from the Faber Academy and sing their praises, and now is the chance for you to get involved with what they do. It's the Writing a Novel course. You can get onto in person if you're in the UK, even online if you're a little further afield. The course is a 6-month programme of sessions that cover all the essentials of novel writing. Character and story and structure and plotting and voice and dialogue, the whole thing. Now, this podcast lets you hear from the best authors around. I think we do a pretty good job of getting some tips and advice that you can help for your own writing day, while this course can take you one step further. It helps you learn face-to-face from the very best. Over 150 graduates from the Writing a Novel course have gone on to secure a publication deal. Some big names in there too. Maddie Mortimer, who did Maps of Our Spectacular Bodies, and of course S.J. Watson, Before I Go to Sleep, which went on to be a mammoth movie at the start of the 2010s. Throughout the course, you'll hear from guest speakers, some of the biggest names in publishing and authors, editors. Now is your chance to be one of the authors who have graduated from the Faber Academy that go on to get published, and then, who knows, maybe even come on this show to tell us about what you've done. You don't just learn how to write, you learn how to pitch, what to do with your finished manuscript. You'll have the chance to pitch a novel to some of the biggest literary agents around too. There are courses in Newcastle and in London starting in October, and online too, so you can take part in wherever you are if you're a little further afield. Now, you need to be quite quick to sign up. Deadlines for both are on the 15th and the 16th of September. You can find out more at faberacademy.com/writing-a-novel. Give a search for Faber Academy Writing a Novel course. You'll find it all there. 6-month course. You can be part of it. You need to be quick. Find out more. Get to faberacademy.com. Well, yes, welcome along to the show. My name is Dan Simpson. This is Writer's Routine. It's where we take a look through an author's working day. We see how they plan their life and their work and their space to give them the best chance of getting it published and out there. Now, if you missed it last week, please do make sure you catch up on our very first fully visualised episode. I've been putting the episodes on YouTube for a little while, but this is the first one where you saw me inside my flat, and we had the full recorded chat with Santa Montefiore, and it's done in just a slightly different way than the audio podcast. So if you've missed it, do make sure you catch up. I'm sort of giving it a test to see how it goes down, and I'd really love your views over on YouTube, and also just letting me know what you think, really. So we are Writer's Routine podcast on YouTube, which sounds about right, doesn't it? And you can see the newest episode fully visualised with Santa Montefiore while you're on there. This week we are joined by J.M. Hall. Jonathan is a playwright, a novelist, and until recently the deputy head of a primary school, and that becomes important. His debut novel, A Spoonful of Murder, came out in 2021. It was followed up in 2023 by A Brush with Death, and the newest is A Clock Stopped Dead, which came out earlier this year. His plays have been produced in theatres and across UK radio too. And we have a long, properly into the reads chat about writing and how it's all changed for him recently. You see, a few months ago, he retired from the day job in the school. And as that to kind of recalibrate, really, we discuss whether the freedom to write is a good thing and how he really needs balance in the day, and whether that balance might have to change many, many years down the line, hopefully, when he gets much older. The novels focus on retired teachers, Pat, Liz and Thelma. They do say, right, well, you know. And these three, they turn to sleuthing. The newest novel, A Clock Stopped Dead, looks at the case of a charity shop that seems to simply vanish overnight, and a deep secret crime that's been buried along the way comes to the surface. You can hear all about why his novelist career started with him trying to unpack a pretty traumatic family situation. Also, why he writes longhand first off, and how he can't understand people who jump straight onto the computer. We chat about designing a writing room and what he wanted for it. It's the dream. How do you make it work when you've got almost a blank canvas? How do you curate the best thing around you to help you be creative? And, well, as Jonathan was a primary school teacher, you can hear all about the books that got us reading when we were young. And, well, on my end, there's quite a lot of praise for Anthony Horowitz in there. So let's jump into it with J.M. Hall, and we start, as we always do, with what he sees around him in the place where he sits down to write.
I see my attic. I see which I'm repurposing as my writing space, because I've just retired. My husband's retired. He had the writing space. He had this as an office space. So I see all my books pushed to one side. I see all the plays I've ever written stacked up. I see everything. And I've got this blank wall covered in smears of paint from matchpots. So it's sort of like the physical equivalent of being the room equivalent of being at the start of a new story.
What smear of paint is catching your eye at the moment? Are you thinking of painting the whole thing? Are they testers?
Yeah, they're testers. They are testers. It's a shade of terracotta, which, you know, it already is, and a shade of grey. So I think I'm going for the one that I think is called something like burnt biscuit. And I think it's going to go with sleuth slate, but really, Dan, it's just terracotta and grey. And I'm just dreaming of the day when it's all sorted and ready and ordered and organised like it should be.
So you're converting this attic. So I'm always a huge fan and very interested when I get to chat to authors like yourself who have the opportunity to create their bespoke writing space. Now, obviously, it's never ideal because you're in an attic in Yorkshire. But when you figured out that you were going to convert the attic, what did you really want in there? What did you want in your writing room?
What I wanted, and it used to be my writing space, because the house we bought they'd already converted this attic into a room. We've got a skylight. I can see the hills one side. I can see the field, the trees of the park on the other. But what I want is to have this sense of a peaceful space, because for years I was writing on my dining room table, which was fine. You know, it was a space, it was great. But what I kind of want here is I want to have all the books that are sent for me to endorse. I want them all on a shelf. I want the Agatha Christie's all together where I can see them. I want my collection of Daleks where I can see them. I want to be able to just sort of know where everything is and just have this sense of unity.
Around you, as well as the multicoloured walls, is there anything that lets you know what you're there to do that day? Post-it notes, kind of plots? Is there a whiteboard? Anything that kind of holds the story?
What I got for my birthday, Dan, was a big whiteboard. This was sort of the reason why I kind of went on such an extensive declutter, downsize, getting rid of video cassettes, a big clean sweep of the past, because I found when I was plotting the last book, I was using sheets of A3 paper and I was having to sellotape them together and they were sort of getting too big. And I thought, yeah, I can understand why people use a whiteboard. So there is a whiteboard. It's not out yet, but it's going to be when the whole space is sorted.
and we're always interested in desks then. So what paraphernalia have you got that surrounds you?
Okay, well, the desk. Oh dear, I don't know if I should say. Yes, I should. Bradford Council, they sort of closed all the council offices and sent everyone to work at home. So this is a Bradford Council desk, but I'm sat in my dad's old chair that he had in his study. On the wall will be the clock from the NatWest Bank he used to work in. And on my desk, I've got it's called like a book chair, which is like a little miniature deck chair, but I prop the writing up on it because I write longhand, so I then transcribe it. And then I find that desks can get very, very, very cluttered, and I periodically have to declutter it.
I've heard of authors being almost scavengers with stories, picking bits from here and there to make another complete tale, but never so much where they've got a clock from the bank, they've got a desk from the council.
My coaster was a wedding present to my mum and dad back in the late 1950s. I have on my book chair, I have a picture that I had on my wall when I worked at the National Theatre. Because you see, I think stories don't just hatch out of nowhere. For me, they don't. They're always got their roots in the past, things that happened, previous things I've written, something I've written and I've thought, do you know what, that was a direction I'd have liked to go in. And so having that sense of your past around you on your desk and everything, for me, it all sort of creates a kind of a unity, as it were.
You mentioned writing longhand as well. That seems like an extra step when you could just do the whole thing on your laptop. Why is that something that you're still doing in 2024?
Well, I think there's two reasons. One is a very basic one, which goes back to 1974. And that thrill of being a kid at school who wasn't good at sport and wasn't good at maths, but suddenly found he was able to fill pages of an exercise book without much difficulty. And that feeling of success and power I got from turning that page, getting to the bottom of the page, turning over the next one. And of course, when I was at university, it was back in the days when you wrote longhand or you used a typewriter. So we were all pre-word processing. So perhaps it's partly from the time I come. But also, I don't understand personally how people can write straight away onto a laptop. Because when I get an idea, it's a very sort of a nebulous thing. It's almost like a dream. It's not rooted in a story. It's a thought, a conversation between two people, a moment when somebody finds something, a realization to someone. Today, I was in the gym and I was on the treadmill and somebody next to me was talking to someone else. And I just thought, what about an overheard conversation in a gym? And that was no idea of a story or whatever. So what I would then do would be write that down on a large sheet of paper. And I would then start exploring it like somebody sketching and think, what could they hear? Who could they hear it? What could it mean? Where would it be in the story? What would the thought be? So you come up with these sketchy ideas, which then gradually start to coalesce a bit into a story. But I would then write them down really quickly, longhand. I would then go over it in a different pen and draw different annotations and diagrams. So to me, that's a really important part of my writing process. And actually, typing up feels like 3, 4, 5 stages down the line. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. And also, if you are enjoying the tactility of writing longhand, Well, we can dive into that a bit because, as you've heard, we're obsessed with things and stuff. So how much pleasure do you get from the notebook and the pen that you use?
I get huge pleasure in buying the notebook. I don't know if you're allowed to do product placement, but I go to the Works and they have these lovely notebooks and I get I get a lot of... There's something very tangible. I'm looking now at this latest novel I'm working on, but actually what I'm looking at are 4 notebooks piled up on the table. And I know they're all full of my writing. And there is something very satisfying with that. When you type something up, the thought always crosses your mind. You know, what if it's lost? What if it's not saved? What if it's gone somehow? So I do actually enjoy the physicality of having it, but I know other people are able to go straight into the typing process, which I think is great. And, you know, all power to them. I'm not knocking it at all. I have a friend who's an artist and we talk a lot about how the early ideas for a picture and a story, they sort of come from that same place, and she explores through little sketches and blobs of colour and ideas, and I explore sort of with the same thing but with words. Before I wrote novels, I wrote plays. So writing has been a habit. Like I'm trying to make the gym, writing has been an ingrained habit. And what I learned many years ago was if I was to write at all, I needed to do it first thing in the morning. So I would get up at 5:10. I would then sort of come round, go downstairs. I would have my sort of quiet meditation time. And I knew then whatever time I had left until my boss, as was then, texted me, said she was on her way, that was my writing time. And sometimes, you know, it might just be 10 minutes. Sometimes it might be an hour and 10 minutes. What I learned was that time, no time was too small. You could have an amazing step forward in 10 minutes. You could sit for an hour and come up with nothing much at all. But that became a real ingrained routine, that sort of beat of writing first thing in the morning. Usually after a day in school, I'd be too tired to properly concentrate, though I could type up. But what I did learn was that writing had to be made. It had to be factored in. Whether you felt like it or not, it had to happen. So that was my working life. Now, I was very fortunate. Well, 2 things. One was I was able to reduce my days from 4 days to 3 days, then 5 days to 4 days, 4 days to 3 days. So I then suddenly found instead of just an hour in the morning, I had an hour in, you know, I had time in the afternoon. I had a whole day or what have you. But the lesson I've carried through from that is that my writing time when it happens and you go with it, almost the worst thing can be to suddenly have all your days free to write. I have to create that routine in. So for me, it's still getting up, not at 5:10, something like 7:30 probably. Again, empty the dishwasher, meditation time, and then I will write. And I'll usually write 2-3 hours, starting to fit into that the gym. And I find that between about midday and 3:00 is a hopeless time for me. But I can usually then pick up at 4:00 and work through till maybe 7. And that is something that has evolved. But what I have learned is I have to have other things in the day. I have to have the gym. I have to have meeting my mate for coffee. I have to have going for a walk at lunchtime. Because otherwise, when you've got too much time, personally, I get lost in it, you know?
In that focused writing time that you have, 2-3 hours, Is there an aim? Are you working just to see how much you can get done in this slot that you've given yourself? Is it more of a word count that you're hoping for?
No, I don't do word counts because to me, it's usually a defined, what's the right word for it? A defined aim, a defined project. So what it might be is, say, writing a chapter longhand, typing a chapter up, going through a typed chapter, scribbling and annotating, retyping it. So I usually try, before I start, to have a clear idea what it is I'm doing, where I'm going. The hardest times for me is in those nebulous early stages of a book when you've got your whiteboard and you've got your pens and you've got your plans and your post-it notes, because I like to think, right, I've got this chapter. At the moment, I'm typing up this novel I'm working on, and I know I've got this chapter to type up. And if I can type it up, print it off, I can take it down when I go to London and read it on the train and scribble and annotate it. So, yeah, I do usually know what I'm going to do. But sometimes, some days in the morning, like when you get up, you're in very often in the shower or meditating, you suddenly think, no, I'm going there today. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do that. I've got this idea. I'm going to follow that today.
Here is a question that I've never asked anyone before, and this is simply because you're retired, nothing to do with your age, okay?
It's okay, yeah.
I'm just thinking, now you're retired and your career as a novelist has, started in the last 3 or so years. And there might be a time as you get much older, you won't be able to kind of fit in as many other things that you like to do. You know, you might not be able to fit in going to the gym every day. You might just be left to you and your partner and hopefully writing. How do you think you'll contend with that being much more of a luxury and all that you've got to fill it is your writing?
It's a question I've asked myself because, Dan, as you get older, you start to think, how long have I got? Because best will in the world, things start to happen to people, perhaps in their 60s, maybe in their 70s. So you have to sort of think, right, that's a possibility. And yeah, physically, like we've both just had COVID, and it's really knocked the stuffing out of my husband. And you've made me think there, what would I do if I still think I would think of other things to do rather than just write. Because there are some days when the best thing you can do for your writing is to leave it. And there are some days when, you've just done enough and you have to think, what am I going to do now? So what would that be if I was sort of physically less able to do stuff? I don't know. Would it be reading more? Would it be listening to radio more? I hope I won't end up watching daytime TV. Nothing wrong with it, but doesn't particularly appeal to me at the moment. But I'd be more worried about losing the writing than losing other things.
Are you writing 5 to 7 days a week? How's it working?
Yeah, when I get into a rhythm, I usually write. I usually do something every day. I do feel you benefit from a day off. They do say, you shall have a Sabbath, but without a particular religious stint on it, I do think whatever you do, it is great to have a day when you just relax. And what we're trying to do, get a routine going, is to go out walking in the hills, because to me that's the ideal way to relax. So I would say I would work ideally 6 days a week. Some days, that's the thing as well with writing, it's not a consistent output. When I worked in a school, you'd know what you were going to do during the week. You'd know what classes you were taking, you know what meetings you were holding, you know what documents you were going to write. And then, of course, you'd be dealing with crises. With writing, you don't know. You can have a week that's incredibly fruitful where you get a good amount done every day. And then you can have weeks when it just isn't going, because creativity isn't predictable. It's not something you can turn off and on like the flick of a switch. Personally, I keep saying personally, because I always am mindful that it's different for everybody.
Yeah, that's completely fine. That's why you're here. But with that flicking on of creativity, or not being able to, rather, for you personally, what have you learned about yourself that helps you maybe get closer to flick the switch on? What helps you kind of promote the creativity in yourself, if there is anything?
I try to work out the night before what I'm going to do and have my desk set out accordingly. So if I know I'm going to be typing up a chapter, I'll have the longhand version all set up on the book desk. I'll have the document created. I'll have written 3 or 4 lines. Just those little things that, like, you know, if you go to the gym and you've already got your gym kit on, it just carries you over that threshold of, oh, here we go again, sort of thing. I try to think as well, before I go, I try to think, right, this is where I'm going today. This is what I'm doing today. This is the ground I want to cover today. Because I find with creativity, now you say that, once I start working on a chapter, it's when I'm working that the ideas come. I don't sort of sit and think, what ideas am I going to have? I start jotting down what's happening or writing something up. And then suddenly, wham, you say, oh, okay, this is what's going on. This is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm going to do. So it's like the ideas come out of the working. So the one thing I can do is make sure my working is all set up, ready in advance.
I'm really interested in why you started writing as a novelist. I know that you've been a playwright for a little while, but you were in senior staff at a primary school, so you're busy. What was the thought process, let's say, I don't know, 6 years ago, whenever you started writing your debut, that you thought, maybe I'm going to fill my other hours with trying this Cosy Crime idea?
Well, there is a story here, because when I set out, I never, ever thought I'd end up writing crime. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love Agatha Christie. I love Vera. I love those dark noir thrillers. The whole notice board with all the photographs on. I love everything. But I never thought this is something I could do. And what happened was, after my mother died, it became apparent that my late father was beginning to suffer from Alzheimer's. And this was obviously a very worrying time for us. But what happened was he was frauded. Somebody rang him up and said, you have to transfer your money out of your account. And he did. And the shocking thing, I mean, it was a terrible, terrible thing. But the most shocking thing was the bank, who were just corporately disinterested. They were just hiding behind all the non-returned emails, all the badly worded excuses. It was just a really shocking reaction from them, because Dad had actually worked for that bank. He had been a bank manager, and the bank he'd got frauded at was the one where he used to be manager. So they knew he was beginning to struggle mentally. So this awful injustice happened, and I spent a year writing. Me and my sister, we wrote to the MP, we wrote to the bank, we wrote to the ombudsman, we wrote to solicitors, we wrote to Gloria Honeyford's community affairs, what program she runs. And we got absolutely nowhere. We wrote to the MP, absolutely nowhere. So there was this huge injustice. And my sister said, oh, you should write about it. And of course, at the time, I was writing fringe theatre. And I just couldn't see this story emerging in a fringe theatre. I just couldn't see it. But I did have an idea that it could be addressed through a crime story. And I loved the idea of having 3 retired primary school teachers investigate, because, you know, that was me, a soon-to-be retired primary school teacher. And there was something about the wisdom and the strength and the humour of the people I've worked with in primary schools that just made it a very cathartic way of working through what had happened. I don't think the phrase Cosy Crime had been coined then. I certainly never thought I was writing a Cosy Crime novel. I was just excising what had happened. And I was going to vanity publish it and give it to my sister in this wine bar we used to go to on Christmas Eve, you know. And that was how the story came about. And then when I was fortunate enough to get an agent, he said, have you got an idea for another one? And I thought, oh, yeah, because actually working in a primary school, there's no end of stories floating around, you know, some heartbreaking, some funny, some downright tragic. And it just seemed, oh, yeah, I could tell this story or this story or this story. And that was how it all came about.
Hello, it's Dan again. Very quickly popping up to thank you for listening and remind you that if you enjoy what we do, if you've learned anything along the way in well over 320 episodes now, you can, well, just give a little bit back by supporting us over on Patreon. Thank you if you're already pledging. If you are making the most of some of the best authors around as often as we can, such a wide variation of different storytellers brought to you more or less every Friday, please do think about becoming a backer on our Patreon page. It's patreon.com/writers routine. For that, you get merch. There is bonus content. There is even a way for your book to sponsor the show. If it deserves more plugging, if you've really worked hard and it's just not found the audience yet, I know how tough the industry is at the moment and getting your stuff seen. Well, let me sing all about it. Thousands and thousands of people listen to the show every week. This week, we are sponsored by Faber Academy. In a few weeks' time, could be your book. Let me do all the singing for it on this show. To make that happen, become a backer over on our Patreon page. It doesn't take a lot, just a few dollars a month. It really keeps us going. It helps me keep bringing you these chats as often as I can. And you can be part of our writing community that we've got with all of our lovely backers over on Patreon. To see what it's all about, get to patreon.com/writers routine. Let's get back in then with J.M. Hall chatting about his newest novel, A Clock Stopped Dead. You can hear all about the planning of the novel, how tricky it is to be writing in a busy cozy crime genre. There's a lot of those stories. How do you get yours heard? How do you make it stand out? And, well, we've heard about why he started writing novels to get to grips with a pretty tricky family situation. Let's dive back in, talking about whether that affected the way he told the story. Jonathan was only planning to write this and share it with his sister over a Christmas Eve drink, and then thought, well, maybe it could get published. The fact that he wasn't really looking for an audience, does he think that made it easier for him or not?
When I used to write plays, and I just wrote them for my friends here in Bradford, and we would take them up to the Edinburgh Fringe, that was great. As soon as I started writing plays that I wanted the National Theatre or the Royal Court Theatre or the Bush Theatre to be interested in, I was writing plays for an audience. I was writing what I thought people wanted to read. And it's the same with the beautiful thing about this story was I was writing it for myself. And what I learned from writing this story was actually, if you're not writing the story for yourself, you know, you've got to really question yourself. I mean, I know people write to briefs and they write, you know, they get these, I think they're called IPs or something, where they're given an outline. All power to them, absolutely fine. But for me, the important thing I did learn was to write these stories for yourself. Tell the stories you want to tell. And that has been the wonderful thing about writing these novels, because I can just tell the stories I want.
When your agent, the publisher, says, "Oh, have you got a second one in mind?" Then it suddenly changes, I would imagine, especially when you're working full time, being very busy at a primary school. Because the first book, you know that there's no pressure on it. You can pick out time as and when. But then when you move into the second, you think, oh, okay, there's money, there's a contract, there's a publisher waiting for it. I need to carve out, as you said, I need to carve out a time in my day to do this. How did you find making that change?
Well, the thing was, Dan, and this was, I almost feel guilty in saying this, but this was when lockdown happened. And suddenly we went from having 200 children in school to having 12. And suddenly everything I did, there was a lot less to it. Setting an online lesson, doing a weekly bulletin newsletter, sorting out 12 kids is much less work. And so really it was during this lockdown, and that was when I dropped down to 3 days a week. So that was when I began to carve the time, because you're right, I couldn't have gone on writing like I did if I'd been doing the job I did when I wrote the first novel. So it sort of like circumstances moved to get me into a place where I could make that change.
More about that circumstance. I know. Obviously, as you just mentioned, the reason that the debut came about was a way for you to talk and think about what you'd been through. If you're being honest as well, because you knew that, well, you might be retiring in a few years, how much did that decision come into play with now becoming a proper full-time novelist?
I've not really thought. Let me think. I knew I was ready to retire. I mean, the school was and is, because I do a morning a week teaching writing, a huge part of my life. But I knew I was ready to get off the roundabout, as it were. So that was really helpful. And I knew then I had the novel writing to go on to. And in a way that got me through because it is a bit scary retiring. I mean, I know everyone goes, oh, wonderful retirement. But there is this sort of, yeah, what now? Hang on, I've stopped. What do I do? Who am I? If I'm not Mr. Hall, the deputy teacher, the person who organises the assemblies and the staff meetings, who am I? So saying I'm actually now J.M. Hall, who writes novels, was really helpful. But I don't think I thought of it in those terms. It's only when you said it just now that I thought, oh, yeah, that makes sense.
I do some stuff for kids as well. So I work in the media, I work on radio, all around kids' content. So I am aware of what it takes to be able to interact and appeal and engage children. And I know firstly, loads and loads of people get it terribly wrong. But there is a difference in what you say and how you impart information and how you need to frame what you do. Spending so long doing that, how much of an impact did that make in when you were coming to write novels for adults?
I think it had a lot. It had a lot of influences in a lot of different ways. For a start, I tell stories to the kids that I make up. So I tell them, the older ones, I tell ghost stories. The younger ones, I make up things that happened to me as a kid and turn them into a story. And you know, when you're telling a story and you're making it up off the kit, you know the second you've lost them. You know the second you're going on too long, you're being self-indulgent, you're repeating, you can see it, and you have to bring it back. And that is something that you carry through into your writing. You think, now, I love this description of the Yorkshire moors on an autumn day. Is anyone else going to think? I've read a lot of children's literature, and I reread certain children's literature every year for myself. I reread Tove Janssen's Moomin Troll stories. I reread The Hobbit. I reread the Arthur Ransom stories. I reread some Joan Aiken stories. I reread E. Nesbit. In fact, I probably read more children's stuff than I do adult. And what I find then is you get ingrained into a really good children's novel. It keeps the pace going. It keeps that pace going. And you sort of get a real undiluted sense of a story moving forward. And the humour and the wisdom and the description that appeals. So that helps. And also, you know, when you're writing, everyone talks about writing for children. And you're right, there is a distinct difference. But I think there's less difference than people would realise. Because I think, you know, a book like Moomin Valley in November, which Tove Jansson wrote when her mother died, and somebody said it's the wisest book about grief ever written. To me, that is an adult book. And then, you know, I read some thrillers with sort of dismembered corpses every 10 pages, and there's a simplicity to it that, you know, that I think the line between them is really blurred. And if you think about, Dan, when you were reading as a kid, how you moved from whatever children's books you read to whatever adults books you read, and the overlap in between. And it's interesting looking at those stories. I went from Enid Blyton to Agatha Christie, but it wasn't one to the other. The two were running side by side for a great long time. So I think there's great value and lessons to be learned in good quality children's fiction.
Well, it's interesting. I never read like willfully silly children's fiction. You know, books about, I don't know, my dog ate my toaster and becomes super dog that poos everywhere. Like I never ever read those.
No, I didn't. Well, they weren't around when I was, but I see them and I look at them because the kids are reading them, and it's like, you know, sort of underpants and farting. And
then I moved on to Anthony Horowitz. So I was of the Alex Rider generation, teenage. So they are pitched dramatically old. I mean, the sentences are perhaps more simple than his adult stuffs, but they're really old books. And then he writes loads of stuff, Anthony Horowitz does. So I kind of read a lot of those. And then I was reading quite old, I seem to remember, when I was young. I don't really recall what I went to, but I was always reading quite older fiction.
You see, I think Anthony Horowitz is someone who is really unsung, because I read in the holidays, I read his latest Daniel Hawthorne book.
Yes, I've read it too. It's good.
Yeah, it's great. And it is really clever and insightful and wise. And yet, if a new Alex Rider book came out, I'd buy it and read it. He's somebody, I think I must have read nearly everything he's written. And he's somebody that just effortlessly tells a really good story. And I have no problem getting to the end of his books.
I actually interviewed him for this podcast, and I said I thought he was one of the country's greatest populist authors. He didn't really enjoy that description, but I just meant that, as you said, he writes a good story that you can get into. There's nothing excessive about it. The language isn't overly done. The plot isn't overly long. You know, you're going to be 300 odd pages of just a very good, rip-roaring novel, really. You're
not fighting against the story to get through it. It's there. And I bought the book because I knew if I started reading it on the journey, it would just make the journey go so much better. And it did.
And it's also, he's undersung, the Hawthorne series of books. So if you're listening and you're not aware, Anthony Horowitz is in them himself. He plays himself as a writer who is hired by a private detective to follow him along and write his life story. And wouldn't you know, they get into loads of scrapes along the way. So it's such a fantastic idea because they're good mystery whodunits. And also, there are elements when it becomes a bit of on writing by Stephen King where there's actually very good tips for how to get down a novel, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. He talks. I remember the one where he wrote the play, and he was talking about writing a play and how this critic came in and just destroyed it. That was just. And the other thing is, he has these elements of real twistiness, like the one where the woman went and ordered her funeral and then was murdered that night. Or the one with the Atticus Punt one, there was the Magpie Murders, where you had half of it was the story and then half of it was finding out the mystery that was hidden in the story. So I great Anthony Horowitz. Well, I find when I do these stories now, there have to be 3 elements I have to have in place. I have to have at the heart of it a story, a crime that makes sense to me, that I can believe in. And I always try and get something that I've heard about. So there was a story, which I won't give a spoiler on, at the heart of The Clock Stopped Dead, which was one I'd wanted to tell for years. It was something that happened to a friend of my sister's. So that was one. I want to think about what's happening with the 3 women in the story at the time. You know, what's it they're going through or what have you. Because what I'm doing with the 3 women is that I'm exploring me going into my 60s and all the things that's bringing. And I'm doing that through the lives of the women. But the real thing is the sort of the hook, the intriguing thing. And I read a story called The Moving Toy Shop, Edmund Crispin, 1930 something. And it was just this person went into a toy shop in the middle of the night and there was a body there. And when they went back the next day, the shop had gone. It was now a grocery shop. And I just loved this idea of a shop that vanished. But I didn't want it just to become a different shop. I'd seen something on TV in the 70s where somebody's walking on a foggy night and they see a murder through a window. They go back the next day with the police and there's nothing there. There's no house, there's no building, it's gone. So I love this idea of a charity shop that somebody goes into and when they go back, it's disappeared. Has it gone? And I wanted to sort of people to think, oh, is this supernatural? Is this something beyond this world or whatever? What has happened here? And I had this idea, and me and my sister were in our happy place, which is this pub in the Lake District in the village called Boot. And we were sat in the beer garden and I said, look, you know, why would you do this? How would this happen? And so she talked me through it. And that was what gave me the seed of The Clock Stopped Dead.
And you mentioned that you cannot understand how people from that idea could just sit there and type away and start writing, that you need a process where you are mind mapping, you're exploring on what used to be sheets of paper, now will be a whiteboard. So what are you asking yourself? What questions are you running through to get to a point where you're able to sit down in your book chair and start writing?
The sorts of questions I'm asking is, why does the charity shop vanish? Why is it there? What reason is it there? Who goes into it? Why is that important? Who goes in? How do the 3 women become involved? Because what is it about the story that makes them think this is something we have to find out about? What happens as a result of this charity shop disappearing? Those are the sort of things, the explorations of the story. It's almost like you start with something. As I sit here, I'm pushing my hands outwards, like, because then the ideas, they go off here, they go off here, they go off here, they go off here. And all sorts of scribbling ideas, and you scribble one and there's a reality to it. And you think, oh yes, That's one I'll use, but I won't use that, and I won't use that, and that's not right, but I'll use that one.
And well, now you're into it, right? With three characters based on different ideas of primary school teachers that you've known along the way. How much simpler is it to write them and to get inside their head than it was 3 books ago?
I would say a lot, because actually the 3 women are as well. They're me. There's sort of worried me, and there's flamboyant me, and there's sort of spiritual, would like to be wise me. So that's not hard at all, but it has to be done. I have to find some story for each of the 3 of them to be exploring. And I couldn't have just think, oh, well, they decide to decorate the garage or something. I'd have to really have something that was very strong and happening in my own life. For example, is this a spoiler? Not really. I'm going to pre-diabetes awareness seminars. Well, I was, and great, my blood sugar's down. So in the 4th book, one of them's going to pre-diabetes awareness seminars. So there is always that element of what's going on in my life.
Because your way of writing is quite particular in that you do your planning, then you do your notebooks, then you go over with the notebooks, and there is a process so that actually the draft on the computer might be 4 or 5 down the line. How much does that way of doing it help editing your novel?
Oh, I think it does help a lot. Book 2 there was a lot in book 2 that needed removing and replacing, and it didn't get going properly. And also with book 1, when I submitted the first draft, they're saying, oh, well, we want this, this doesn't work. Can you replace this? And by the time I got to book 3, there was less to do. And it was the same. I'm crossing my fingers as well with book 4. And I felt like but I think because I'm doing what I'm doing, it's quite painstaking. It's quite slow. And I'm imagining that if I was writing longhand, so if I was writing on a keyboard, it might be quite easy to go sort of charging off in a wrong direction and have to bring it back from there. Whereas when you're writing longhand, you sort of get a sense when you're writing. When you're typing and it's quicker and there's something that isn't really working, there is a way you can type so quickly and almost type your way past it, type your way through it. But when you're writing, there's a sort of a leaden quality to the longhand process. And you start to think, this is a real chore. Why is this a chore? This isn't working. Why isn't this working? I think that's why. So I do think there's something about writing longhand that does make you go at a slower pace so that you're able to spot these wrong directions.
Have you kind of like learned what to do when it isn't working?
Yeah, I've learned. It's like I've learned to sort of almost pull it back, to step back from it and try and identify why it isn't working. And it's usually something about there's a question I don't know the answer to. So it might be a scene and there are 2 people and they find something, and I don't know how the other person, one of the people, is going to react. I don't know what their reaction is. And so then to sort of step back and plot that out on paper. What does she think? Does she think this? Does she think this? Does she think this? So it is a question of trying to work out what the problem is. And I used to think that maybe there's an answer there, that's something I've not thought of, that's some element of the story that hasn't happened or something else I need to go. And I find now nearly always the answer is in what I've done. It's there in what I've done. It's not there in some different direction or whatever. I sort of go back a bit and I see if I can find something that will help me move forward through the problem.
Now, I know you said that when you first started writing, you really had no idea that this would become Cosy Crime, but I believe that it is. And that there's a lot of Cosy Crime out there, which is good because it means there is definitely a market for your book. You become published, but also I guess you could say the negative is that there's so much that it might be tricky to make yours stand out. How much thought do you give to that?
When I was writing theatre, and I went through a complete wilderness from about 2006, and I learnt, not easily, but I learnt I've got no control of what people think of my writing, and I've got no control of what happens to my writing. And the only thing I can control is the writing itself. And there's a real peace in that. So I can think now, well, do you know what? If there isn't a market for it or whatever, I know I'll still go on writing and it'll still be that wonderful world for me. I don't actually need to have it published to get that affirmation. I know if I was listening to this and I had never been published, I would be thinking, oh my God, who does he think he is? You know, and I really want to, everyone who's thinking that at this moment, I apologize. But the one thing I am very good at is writing as a sort of a commercial failure of being rejected. And I have learned to make my peace with that. So that's one side of it. And the other side is myself. You know, we spoke earlier, Dan, about, you know, not knowing how much writing time I've got left. I am writing other novels as well. I want to write, I want to write stuff that isn't just crime. Now I've discovered there's other stories I want to tell. There's sort of LGBT stories I want to tell and what have you. So I think if the publishers said, you know, which they might well do you know what, thank you, that was lovely, but we don't want anything else, I think, well, you know what, I'll go off in this direction. And then at the end of the day, I'll have had books published, which, you know, it doesn't get better than that. That is wonderful. That is fantastic. And I'm so thankful. And just because the book stopped being published, doesn't take that away from me. But I do like to think that even if it all stopped, I'd still be up here in my writing room at 7:30 a.m, writing away. Because that's the other thing, Dan. I don't know if you find this. When you're writing at that time and you're on your own, you're writing an Olivier Award-winning play and a Booker Prize-winning novel, you know, and sometimes the glow of that accolade in those long, lonely writing times can be the best bit of it.
And that's it for this week's Writer's Routine with J.M. Hall. The new novel is A Clock Stopped Dead. You can pick up a copy right now. If you missed last week's episode with Santa Montefiore, we've got a fully visualised version that you can check out. You can watch the whole thing if that's how you prefer your podcasts. Just search for Writer's Routine over on YouTube. You'll find us there. We've got it on all the links on all our social pages too. This week's episode is sponsored by Faber Academy. Their flagship course, the Writing a Novel course, is back. It's 6 months of brilliant tuition and experience from some of the best writers around. It will help you get your book done and hopefully onto shelves. They've got in-person courses in London and up in Newcastle, and you can do it remote too if you're a little further afield. Deadlines close soon for the course, which starts in October, so you need to be quick to sign up. Find out more, get to faberacademy.com/writing-a-novel, search Faber Academy Writing a Novel course, and it will come up. I'll be back next week with a brand new episode of the show. In the meantime, you can support us over on our Patreon page. Drop a follow on our X page as well, at WritersPod. We're on TikTok as well, dropping updates there, Writers Routine over there, and you can get in contact at writersroutine.com. That's a lot of links, so I'll get out of your hair. Thank you very much for listening. I'll see you soon.